Alright, good morning. What's up, people? So, another book review. Sherwood Anderson. I'm not sure how to pronounce it and I haven't checked, but maybe it's Winesburg, Ohio, or Winesburg, Ohio, and I'm going to just stick with Winesburg, Ohio for this video. So, you want me to get into what I thought of it? Yeah, super good, super good. I mean, it's not a novel, it's a collection of short stories, saying the obvious. But it almost reminds me a bit like of Winnie the Pooh by A.A. Milne, in the sense that you have all of these stories that set the tone of this town. So every story is about the town, but every story is separated. And so over the course of the book, these stories build up an image of the people in the town and the town itself, which is really cool. There is also a consistent character through most of the stories, George Willard, who kind of crops up here and there in some stories with a small role, with other stories he takes on a bigger role, and some stories are about George Willard himself, which is interesting, as I think that Sherwood Anderson would relate to the character of George Willard mostly because he's a journalist and a writer. And so we do have kind of this plot line, which is the coming-of-age story of George Willard throughout the book, but then the book in general spans way beyond the lifetime of George Willard. It's some of the characters go, the family trees are just amazing. I mean, Sherwood Anderson has obviously sat there for a very long time thinking about every family tree of like each character and the grandparents, and I mean maybe he even thought of the grandparents, even though they're not even mentioned in the book, but you kind of get the feeling that he did, because everything is, I mean, the lives of the characters are incredibly well thought out, and everybody has a family tree, and they're all interconnected in many ways, and that is super cool. When we talk about the structure of the short stories, realize that Sherwood Anderson maintains this consistency throughout the book. So the structure of the stories, he usually starts with a character or a setting and develops that. There's not a particular scene, but it's a development of the setting of the character. Moving further forward, he's given the details of the characters' lives, the backstories. Again, there's no scene, or we don't jump into a steady action. It's narration there, and it's a speeding up of the timeline, giving certain important events of that particular character's life without going into, there's no movie scene, there's just a recap of the character's most important events. Then we develop it into the beginnings of a scene through, like, I think he does kind of like mini scenes where it's like, oh, and then this really important thing goes into it, and then this important thing, and then here's the thing that I want to tell you about. And he usually ends with a very poignant point, which is psychological or could be religious in some cases, which was awesome. And these are the points. These are what really made me like Sherwood Anderson as opposed to someone like Raymond Carver. Raymond Carver in Would You Please Be Quiet Please jumps usually straight into the scene. Bam, 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 bam. It's all go, 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 go. But then the way that Raymond Carver ends is very loose and very left up to interpretation by the reader. Whereas Sherwood Anderson, like I've said, starts not without a scene, leads carefully up towards the scene, lets you build lets you build up an understanding of the character, then goes into the scene, and then there's a punch at the end where it's like, bam, here's what I wanted to say. Here's the point. Here's what this character feels. And so I personally loved almost all. There were a few endings in that book which I didn't particularly like. Which didn't really resonate with me, even though they were good endings. They didn't, like I say, have that impact I felt. Then there were other endings. Stories where one woman, I think it was loneliness, and it was about loneliness, and she runs back into her room and she lies on her bed and faces the wall with the knowledge of the fact that there are some people in the world who will have to live and die alone, even in Winesburg, Ohio. I mean, powerful ending. Like, bam, hard hitting, cold truth. Kind of like suffering that needs to be expressed in a book. Because it's great to be optimistic, but then there are these cold truths, and they do need to be expressed. And in such a powerful way too. That's art. Another story about the religious minister, I think, or the priest, or the preacher of the church. And so he sees a woman outside through a gap in the stained glass window, and he's admiring her neck and her shoulders, and he's saying, why is God tempting me like that? Why is God tempting me like that? Why is God tempting me like that? Then she comes into the room one night totally naked, and then leans down on the bed and starts to pray. He said, I have seen the image of God in the woman that I was lusting, and therefore it was not a temptation of God. It was a display of spirituality in the things that I thought were like debased. I'm paraphrasing. I'm really paraphrasing that. But that was a really cool ending. So, was that the essential idea was that God is in everything. So what you thought was a temptation was actually leading up to be another vision of God and a better understanding of who God is. So that was a very, very cool story with a big ending. Which brings me to the next point, that the story is actually, those ones interlinked. So it was nice that we had one story about the priest, but then actually the next story was about that woman who we saw naked on the bed. So then we go into her story. So by showing the different stories of the characters, and then the next short story is about this character, but we now shed a different light on the story that we read before, because we see it from the different characters' point of view, and we understand that there is more going on. There's more than meets the eye, which is very cool, because we understand that when we meet people in real life, they also have way more going on behind what we initially see. So the book was like a matrix of human life, which is very cool. And if you put yourself, and if you would say that you were a character in a town, you would say that you personally have a very limited perspective, because you understand that there's all of these stories happening in the town. And so we can see that by reading Winesburg, Ohio. Well, that's 10 minutes, and so I loved it. I thought it was great. I think there's a lot to learn from it. I think that a lot of awesome truths are written about in that book, and there's some great quotes in there. One of them, where George Willard? It's like he fails to understand something a woman is trying to tell him, and then he gets a rage. It's like he sat down on a bed in a rage, as all baffled men. Which is, again, I'm paraphrasing, but a very cool line. As you go, yeah, well, actually, when I'm in a rage, it's usually because I'm confused and I lack understanding. So it's nice that somebody else expressed that idea, just to give me a bit more comfort in my emotions, to understand where my emotions are coming from. So Sherwood Anderson has given that piece of knowledge to me, and I'm thankful for that. And yeah, I could say it's not a novel, but it is a fantastic collection of short stories. And if you're looking to read some short stories, I highly recommend it. I think you're going to really get something out of it. I think you're going to love it.